Thank you, and thank you for having me. It's really an honor to be here. And I was excited when Leah had been sort of prodding me to send my title to see actually on the website of the Hafenreffer that there has been a major grant from the Mellon Foundation has been given to the Hafenreffer to do some quite challenging task of moving your collections. We've just been through a sort of move of a part of our collections, about a third of our sort of 3D object collections, and I know the headaches that can sort of cause, especially as ethnographic collections, apart from being contested collections often, and they've been for a long time, obviously. They are also sort of hazardous. So in our case, this was dealing with pigeon pests and explosive harpoons and squatters taking over the building where the collections were, and Abrus seeds poisonings, where the whole sort of emergency services took over the building and cordoned off the whole area, because Abrus seed is highly poisonous when it kills in a couple of hours. So unless you do, I mean, I have it in my jewelry box, so a lot of people use it, but and I've actually given it to my kids to wear. But you shouldn't be, stepping on it or sort of crushing it, because when it becomes airborne, it can kill quite, which luckily didn't happen, but I do know that these sort of projects actually sort of take over your whole life as a museum director. So, congratulations and good luck. But today I want to share with you some approaches that we at the Pitt Rivers Museum, and I must say this is really projects from all of the staff. So this is not that I've been involved, and I've not sort of set all of this up, but we have been sort of jointly, when I started 3 years ago there, we sort of jointly started thinking about what we wanted to do and wrote a strategic plan for the next 5 years. And so it was very similar to what you were saying, sort of about how do we understand our past, how do we imagine new futures together, and actually how do we talk about cross-cultural understanding together. So we sort of outlined what we felt the museum should do. And then sort of, and obviously once one starts doing and implementing such a strategic plan, you start looking for approaches that you can use to actually do this in a way that that it has integrity, I suppose. So I'll be taking you through a little bit of the history of the museum, because it's important to understand the history. I think the image sort of already, for those who haven't been to the Pitt Rivers Museum, will tell you that it's a very densely multi-layered. So we have 55,000 objects on display, and in a very small space. This is it. There's not more than that, apart from a new extension which has sort of contemporary exhibitions and special exhibitions, but that's a very small space. This is just about as big as this, more or less, which is our temporary exhibition space. So but the museum was founded in 1884 when General Augustus Lane Fox Pitt Rivers donated 26,000 objects to the University of Oxford. He was a well-known collector and also a well-known archaeologist. He's sort of almost the founder of British archaeology. And he was driven by a strong desire for public education. And he was inspired, he married into academic circles, and he was inspired by Charles Darwin's evolution of species, and this is where it becomes a bit tricky. And he thought, as did many anthropologists at the time, that there maybe this evolution, this Darwin's work might also be applicable to social evolution. So it might also be, we could use that as a model to explain how different cultures had evolved. And so there were 3 stages. There was savagery, barbarism, and civilization. And he thought that to illustrate or to sort of find ways to look at where which culture was, one might look at an evolution in form. And actually that evolution in form, he would then make these really big panels where he would sort of say, okay, similar sorts of objects, like boomerangs and clubs, etc. Let's put them all in ranges and then sort of look at, where were people in which, and so that sort of was translated. This is a very early photo of the museum, and none of this is still there. People think that the museum is a museum of the museum, and that this Pitt Rivers Museum is has never been touched since the 19th century. And when I started as a director, I received lots of emails saying, "Don't change anything." So people were very worried, I think, when they read that I was going to be the director of the Pitt Rivers Museum. But things have changed always. And but what Balfour did, which was the first curator, which now we would call director, but at that time was, and he dedicated 50 years of his life to installing this collection of 26,000 objects, plus also collected a lot more during those 50 years. Now, 7 directors have been the main directors. There's a couple of interim directors, but actually there's been a series of 7 directors. And I think all of us have sort of tried to find relevance in different temporalities. So up until the Second World War, the museum was very much driven by ideas of this social evolutionism, and then shifted to illustrating technological developments. So it's also sort of seen as a sort of early technologies museum. And then driven by sort of the next director, driven by sort of post-colonial utopian ideas, started to think about, couldn't this museum actually be housed in a very different sort of space? And so he starts to think about a completely different museum. He gets allocated some really centrally located plot of land, actually, where now houses another college, and has this sort of utopian building of a rotunda of 52 meters wide and 4 different floors, which was the idea that he was going to be able to sort of, people would be able to read the museum very differently. And then actually for almost 30 years, that occupied every director from then on to have a new building. They then get allocated, they don't know how to raise the funding for this new building, so it never gets built. It's part of unbuilt Oxford, as they, and there's lots of them. But they do, you continue to look for a new building because the collections have grown so much that it's actually impossible to still fit in the old building. They get allocated a new building, which is how the university sort of works, right? It's one of the 4 university museums. And in Oxford, it's very difficult to get any space because it's quite densely inhabited. And the colleges own most of the land. So they get allocated this other building, but it's another Victorian age space, and it's leaking, and they're sort of constantly battling that building is actually completely unfit for purpose. And then Michael Hanlon, who's my predecessor, is very much the one who actually then decides not to continue to invest in this new building, but actually build an extension to the old building, which is where now, then that's when all the staff could come back and be all in the same museum again, which is the moment that I inherited the museum from Mike, who actually did a fantastic job in making sure that I don't have to be driven by capital investment, but actually can look at more sort of other parts of the museum. Now, the current vision, which is sort of out, is in our strategic plan, is very different from what was in 1903. Outside of the museum's door, it sort of announced what the object was of this collection. And so, as you will be able to read, and I've sort of made it a little bit bigger and just picked out the ones that were the most typical, I suppose, is to explain the conservatism of savage and barbarous races and the pertinacity with which they retain their ancient types of art, to illustrate the arts of the prehistoric times as far as practicable by those of existing savages in corresponding stages of civilization, and to aid in the solution of the problem, that's the one I like most, where a man has arisen from a condition resembling the brutes or fallen from a high state of perfection. So that is very different to what we today want to do with the museum, and obviously it's very different from what Mike and Skylar Jones and many of the other directors wanted to do with the museum. But it was the explanation that was given to visitors beginning of the 20th century and the end of the 19th century when they were coming into the museum. So a lot of that sort of legacy of its founder and the first directors, and also the further colonial sort of thinking, very much is embedded in what the museum is embedded in the collections, and so it needs to be unpicked and unpacked and challenged somewhat. So in that sense, that's part of the work that I'll be talking about today. So our vision today is more to inspire and share knowledge and understanding with global audiences about humanity's many ways of knowing, many ways of being, so many epistemologies, many ontologies, many ways of creating and coping in our interconnected worlds by providing a world-leading museum for because it's Oxford, so we have to be world-leading, and for the cross-disciplinary study of humanity through material culture. So we want to think through objects, we want to address things through things. So we very much are not looking to get away from our collections, but actually utilize them and unlock them and activate them in new ways. Now, the visitors to the museum have completely spiked over the last couple of years in particular, and we are, this year we had over 500,000 visitors, which for an ethnographic museum is quite exceptional. There's not many ethnographic museums that actually reach those sorts of numbers, especially because our marketing budget is about close to £3,000, I think. It's probably similar. So we don't do a lot of marketing. But we are a very sort of, if you look at TripAdvisor, Google, Facebook, Yelp, we get the highest ratings of all the Oxford museums because it's such a particular, unique space. So there's nothing like it in the world. But at the there was a PR advisor who told me once, he said, yeah, Laura, if you want to know whether someone was born in Oxford or moved there afterwards, ask them what their favorite museum is. If they're local, they'll say the Pitt Rivers Museum. If they're not local, they might say the Ashmolean or the Pitt Rivers. And it's very true. So we're very loved, and therefore when change is being discussed, or worst of all, and I'll come back to that very shortly, the shrunken heads, so we have human remains on display, and the shrunken heads are even discussed. So we've just dealt with a whole media storm about the shrunken heads. Well, nothing's happening to the shrunken heads, but people get very anxious, and literally anxious in Oxford, because there's a sort of sense of entitlement of having the shrunken heads on display, and it's interesting to find out more why people feel so entitled to have them on display. But however, while this for many people the Pitt Rivers Museum is their all-time favorite museum in the world, for others it's the opposite. It's a space that makes them feel very uncomfortable, and mostly people who didn't benefit from empire, who were not on the side of that benefited from empire, but actually the side that suffered its violence, feel very uncomfortable in this museum. And so that's the sort of part, and in post-colonial literature we've been called many things, and amongst others that we are the preserve of colonialism and the manifestation of the denial of co-evilness. Co-evilness is a term that I don't know how many of you have studied anthropology, but if you haven't, it's a term coined by Johannes Fabian that sort of describes the phenomenon that anthropologists will go into the field, and while they're there they have a co-presence with the people that they're studying and with the things that they are collecting, but when they return back to their offices they start writing about it as if it's in a distant past or a distant other place. And so that idea of sort of we are living in a co-presence, especially in this place, is seen as a manifestation of the denial of that people actually are all living in on the same planet in the same period of time. And then also, just before I started, there was a tweet by the Rose Must Fall campaign. I don't know how many of you know what Rose Must Fall was. A student campaign which really was about sort of having more equal access and also decolonizing Oxford. Its curriculum, its architecture, and a number of spaces were singled out as the most problematic. So the Pitt Rivers Museum was one of them. We had marches in the streets, and so it was certainly one of the reasons that was given by an article in the student newspaper by Quoba was that it houses thousands of artifacts stolen from colonized peoples throughout the world. So that was very much one of the reasons. Now, if you look at our collections, which are about 600,000. It's always difficult, we were just saying, it's difficult to know how do you count Do you count each shirt or do you count a bag of shirts? Makes a big difference if you have archaeological collections. But in general, sort of this is, if you look at sort of when collections were collected, which was very much, you know, the initial collection that came in from the general, which was from the 1840s, and then until actually Balfour stops being its director in the 1940s, that's when most of the collecting happened, and a little bit still until the 1950s, let's say. So that's very much, and then when we look at sort of when people were collecting and what their ideas were when they were collecting, and we can see the numbers being really huge here, but much smaller here. And now we collect very, you know, we continue to collect with very sort of specific pieces that we really feel we want to bring in as, and I'll talk a little bit about a couple of things that we've collected recently. But if you map out those collections and go into a little bit more granular data on what are these European collections, the Asia collections, Africa, Oceania, and the Americas, it maps on quite well on where empire was present. So we can't really deny that fact. So in that sense, there is it's clear that sort of that there's an issue there that we need to address, and we shouldn't shy away from it or deny it, because I don't think that that's very useful to do. And so not immediately the focus of these student campaigns, I don't know why not, but possibly because they didn't know the collection so well. There's also issues that are quite prominent in our minds that need attention, such as displays, which use quite euphemistic language. So for example, the Benin bronzes is a very well-documented case of punitive campaign and looting and plundering, and women and children were murdered. Currently, the display, and we've just started a project around that, is called Court Art of Benin. So it sounds very sort of innocent. And at the same time, we hold collections that actually illustrate the taking of that court art, where you can see the photography down there. There's the shrunken heads, which is quite well known in our treatment of dead enemies case, which is one of the cases where we know that we are not compliant with the regulations of the ethical code. So we need to review that, but also we're reaching out to Shuar communities and seeing how they would like to be represented. Even if the Shuar wouldn't have an objection to the way that the shrunken heads are on display currently, we will still need to change it because of the ethical code, but also because when we were listening in, and that was the whole media storm, when we were listening in, and there's a student who did his PhD on this, listening into what people were saying standing in front of the case, the words that were being used were really completely contradictory to what we would want to tell with that case, which was, it was gory and it was a freak show and it was primitive and savage people, and so there's a whole issue there on how do you tell a story through interpretation, such a complicated story, such as the shrunken head story, for example. Other issues lie in our labels and in objects such as human remains that we still have in the collections, and I'll go in a bit more deeper into objects that actually aren't so clear that they are problematic, such as, you know, human remains is quite, okay, shrunken heads, yes, I think all of us can sort of, but there's also collections where came in the 1990s or in the 1960s, but now that we're working, for example, in one project with the Maasai, they're actually indicating that specific of those objects are still causing damage in Maasai territory for having been taken from the Maasai territories. So that's where I think there's this whole complex set of things that we need to somehow deal with. And as a friend of mine also said, because there's moments when one gets a bit sort of, oh, I don't know how we're ever going to do this. He said, 400 years or 500 years of colonialism will not be undone in a couple of years. So I think that's absolutely true, and that always gives us hope that we can, you know, so we'll need to use the time, but we need to use it in a way that it's helpful. So, and then I suppose on the shrunken heads in particular, it's been quite interesting to see that there's this sort of entangled entitlements. I'm writing an article about that, where it's interesting to see how on the one hand there's people who say you should send them all back, while the Shuar are not asking them back currently. And others say you can't send them back, they're ours. And they were from there anyway, so who would you be sending them back to? Which are mostly Oxonians who, and it's really interesting to see, I really have a keen interest to know why people, even people like Philip Pullman, who's a famous author, and J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter, the writer of Harry Potter, have strong opinions about these shrunken heads in Oxford. And I'm just really keen to know why and how that works. And so I've copied a lot of the comments that came under some of these articles. For example, in the Daily Mail was a page big article about this. And so I'm going to be studying a little bit what is it that people are saying about this. And a lot of it had to do with Brexit and with the MPs. And actually, there's a lot of shrunken heads to be gotten from the House of Commons, where a lot of the comments. But it's really interesting. Some of them were hilarious. Others were really racist and horrible. But yeah, so it's interesting to sort of then take that as a also to just on the one hand try to listen, because for a lot of people it's also because it's a sort of it's a memory that's rooted in their childhood. So they have stood in front of the case with their grandparents or their parents, being told, about these shrunken heads and being impacted by them. And so that's where I'd like to unpack a little bit what's happening there. Now, and this is George Orwell saying, who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past. So for us, it's really important who is talking about these things that are in our care, that we've taken the responsibility to care for. And and I think also sort of to be very careful both about how we talk about collections, who is invited to talk about them, and what responsible care in the 21st century would look like. Are we still talking about preservation mostly, or are we also including cultural care? And if cultural care is an aspect of this care that we want to give as museums, then what does that mean for having these objects in the places that they reside currently? Or might some of these objects have to go back to the places where they were originated? So we've also sort of thinking about which stories are we telling, which have we told a lot of, and which have we not told and actually silenced or erased. So those are also components of what we're sort of looking at and seeing. For a very long time, we've given a lot of authority to who were these collectors. I think since the 90s, there's this huge interest in who the collectors were. And many times that has sort of concentrated mostly on male collectors. So white, male, cisgendered, quite privileged because they were from Oxford, most of them, collectors. And we're trying to sort of see, is there maybe other stories that we haven't been telling? So we just, actually this exhibition is closed, but we've just done an exhibition on intrepid women, which was very much on female collectors, which were, for a lot of the, especially female visitors, was really a sort of eye-opener to see really early collecting happening at the Pitt Rivers Museum by women. And we did question ourselves, why are we calling them intrepid? Just because they went far and early? No, many of them actually were very much involved also in resistance movements, for example, and anti-racism. So that's where they were quite exceptional. Now we do a lot of effort in putting all our collections online. We receive about 1 million visits from really literally every recognized region in the world and every country in the world. And we have about 600 research visits from scholars, community members, artists, all sorts of people who are sort of stakeholders in the museum. We also spend fortunes on ensuring that the collections are, sort of sector-leading care, preservation is given to the collections. And we invest in new storage spaces. We're going to be sort of moving our textile collections, which we have about 8,000 textiles from across the globe. So we're fundraising for that. That's why we have these sort of images, what it might look like once we can. And working also quite closely with collaborators from across. So and this is through an organization called Nest that works with female crafts people and connecting them with actually some of the fashion industry, which obviously is one of the most polluting industries in the world, and looking at how can there actually be more equity between those makers. And so we want to see if we can partner with them. So we look for partnerships to ensure that we can do a lot more than just packing up the collections. Now, when I'm talking about these new approaches, and when we're thinking about this sort of responsible care in a city like Oxford, where we're based, and a museum like ours in the 21st century, what does it mean to take care of things? Now, things that we know are often not just things for the people who they matter to. They're often animated, they are ancestors, and they tell stories of violence, but also of invention and creativity and ingenuity, design, technology of the makers of, and so how do we unlock those many meanings in ways that do not continue to foreground merely the sort of patriarchy, but even those sort of, but actually looking at ways that they can be of relevance today for many communities. So not just for indigenous peoples, but actually also other communities. So I'll give a couple of examples of what we've been sort of doing. And I'm glad to say that our biggest investment currently is not building new sites, but actually in the social side of things and sort of developing socially engaged practice with partners. So we firmly believe that museums like ours are spaces for the co-production of knowledge. That's what we think ethnography and anthropology is, or should be. And connecting peoples and reconnecting people with things. And we also believe that there's a lot of unhelpful hurdles for that to actually be happening. And so that's why we have 4 sort of key themes that we work around, that all our programming and quite a bit of our research investment and collecting happens around these 4 themes. So there's hope, which is really about resilience and redress and reconciliation. No binaries, where we queer and question our collections and our displays with LGBT communities. No boundaries, which is around home and belonging, and this whole spring period and summer they will have several exhibitions opening that actually deal with sort of home and belonging, working with lots of communities again, and then making the creative case for health and well-being, which is the 4th, which is very much about makers, but also how that's related to health and well-being. Now, hope is about resilience and redress and reconciliation, and so in that we have quite a long trajectory, and so people like Laura Pierce, for example, working with the Haida Gwaii communities, has the long trajectories of doing visual repatriation. Same with the San in South Africa. We've done in Botswana. We've done projects with Australia. This was in 2017. Repatriated human remains, and we've been obviously the issue around repatriation is always that it's always very, very complex and complicated, and often takes much longer than one would expect. We are in a repatriation request from Australia, and then New Zealand and Australia and the US have quite well organized national sort of systems and support structures for indigenous peoples, which doesn't go for most of the other communities in the around the globe, apart from Canada. And then there's some conversations happening, which is called the Benin Dialogue, around the Benin bronzes. And this is really a dialogue of different museums across Europe with the Royal Court, so the Royal Court of Edo, and the National Ministry of Monuments in Nigeria, to make sure that there's going to be a continuous presence of royal bronzes in Benin. And for many, that will in the end mean that repatriation will actually be discussed quite soon. For others, that's more difficult because of national legislation, for example, for the British Museum. Now, another project that I wanted to sort of talk about, which also is sort of in that programming line of hope, is a project that we've developed with the Maasai. And that's called the sort of Living Cultures Project. And this started when in 2017, Samuel Nangiria, who's here at the left, who's a human rights activist, came to visit the museum. And we had brought out so we were working together with Insight Share, which is a participatory video making NGO. And they train indigenous peoples to train other of their communities to actually make videos to do advocacy around or against land grabs and around sovereignty and all those sort of things. they're based in Oxford, so we had sort of been introduced to each other, and we felt that there was a lot around self-representation and sort of that bound us. So we thought, why don't we work together? So they had an Indigenous leadership program, and so Samuel came, we had these objects out, and he said, ooh, I don't understand how these could be here. This is quite problematic, Laura, we have to talk. So I said, okay, that's fine. So he went home and then went to, because they're so good at video making, we actually now have wonderful videos of him and elders from the community sitting sort of in a half circle. And they were all sort of talking to me and saying that they were annoyed that these things had been taken and they shouldn't be in the UK. And so we invited them. I sent the video back, and we invited them to come because Samuel had written this really sort of aspirational email about what he would like to do with the museum. So he gave the reasons why he found it problematic, that they were collected by missionaries, and he didn't understand what the process was, why they would have been purchased by the museum while they were collected by missionaries, and these things were not things that he would have expected people would have been sort of giving away or selling, that the accompanying information wasn't accurate, that some are so sacred they should be handled by the cleansed, they should not be handled by people who weren't initiated, and that irritated their minds and hearts, and that objects are kept to represent dead knowledge. So to him, these objects being in the museum meant that actually they were almost like declared dead. And so it was almost a declaration of the museum, of the Maasai being declared dead, which for them resonated very strongly with what in Tanzania the government would like, because of land concessions, etc. So he then wrote to me, I'm imagining a partnership piloted between your museum and the Maasai indigenous communities to figure around the inclusion of living culture in the bigger framework of museums. This will accommodate thousands of indigenous peoples around the world and will provide a benchmark for a healing process for the so much damaged hearts, knowledges and cultures of these isolated, marginalized yet important groups in our planet. So that was obviously not something I could say no to. We then sort of had 5 representatives of the Maasai coming to visit. We did quite a bit of research. And one of the objects that was discussed, so we looked at 75 objects of the 180 that we have, so they're coming back still, hopefully in the summer. And one of them was this object, which was of those 75, 6 objects were identified as really problematic. All the rest was actually fine and unproblematic. And so one example was, a good example was this Isuruchia, which is a necklace. I don't know if anyone is here, especially some Maasai, but it's a necklace sort of coiled metal and with a leather sort of thread, which is sent as a dowry. It's sent as part of the dowry, but also almost like a contract, an insurance contract. So the woman who's marrying into the family of the man walks with 4 sheep and I think 2 cows or something to the family that she's marrying into, and this thing is around the neck of the sheep. And these are when the dowry is sent over to her family, obviously. And then the Isuruchia is placed around her neck, and it guarantees that whatever happens to the woman, she will always be taken care of by this new family that she's marrying into. And also, if she dies, that family has a responsibility to take care of her children, because the Isuruchia will go to her child. But if you do away with it, if you sell it or if you lose it, actually it means that there will be sort of eternal doom on your family, your children will be stillborn, your cattle will die. So there's this sort of almost, to them it just felt like, and you could notice it immediately with the reactions when an object like this was brought out, where people said, oh, this shouldn't be here. So we're now looking with the spiritual leader of the Maasai and of Kenya and Tanzania to look, who is coming to the museum to see what might be done. So there were different options. It could either be that the object needed to be destroyed, it could be that the object needed to be returned, or it could be that they could do a ritual to just cut off the ties between the family member and the object, and it could stay in the museum. So we'll see what happens. And I'm quite open. I always think if you're doing these sort of projects, you shouldn't from the outset say, this is the only thing that we're allowed to do. because then we're not taking each other seriously. And then there was lots of press attention. And again, interesting to see the reactions of the public to an article that was published in The Guardian, where 1/3 sort of said, send it all back. 1/3 said, they should be happy that you kept it. And 1/3 said, why don't you make digital copies? We have really great printing techniques these days, and send the originals back. Which was a new, interesting possible solution, which I think more and more museums are keen to start exploring, I suppose. Other projects that we're doing is really working and ensuring that we're bringing in bright, brilliant young scholars who are from Africa, for example, in this case, as global. So this was a Mellon Visiting Global South professorships and fellowships, which really are offering new readings to the collections. There's a project that we've just started on our labels, because we're a teaching space. We really have our labels open in the museum, and we ensure that people can read what's written on the objects. But often that sort of language is really problematic. So in the 1990s, Lebo Di Secco, who is now a BBC broadcaster for the BBC News, she came to the museum and she spoke in a documentary that was made by one of our patrons, David Attenborough, about how she was really offended by finding this word, kafir, which is the same as the N-word in South Africa, so openly staring at her from objects that were on display. And so at that time, one of our staff members who's still at the museum was tasked to go around with a pot of Tipex in the museum and Tipex out the word kafir from those labels, so whitening out the racism that was actually on the labels. And there was one that was missed, which is that one. But other words, such as savages or blackfellows, which again, very problematic, or the N-word, for example, written on objects, are very much still all part of the collections. And I think in our case, currently we're not, because I'm getting lots of letters again of people who are concerned that an enlightened director would know what to do with these labels and just leave them alone, is not that we are going to be removing the labels, but we don't want them to be unmediated. We are a mediated space, we're a curated space, and currently they're just staring at people as if we are condoning that sort of language. Why don't we use it as a place where we can talk about this sort of violence, about racism, about eugenics, which was very much part of the discipline of anthropology, naturally. And so I think it's something that we could own up to and actually talk about how language matters and how it matters what language we use in the museum. Another project that's just starting, so both of those are just starting this week actually, is about recollecting colonialism. So again, this is really where we're going to be doing co-curatorial sort of collaborative writing around this case and rewriting the way that we are now speaking about the cases while we're in conversations with the Royal Court about possible returns. And the Royal Court has visited twice now Oxford, but it's the people who are really leading on the Benin dialogue are Berlin and the British Museum, because they have the biggest collections. Other projects are around no binary, so we're really querying and questioning the collections. And what we see in the sort of remarks that we get is that people really find it quite inspiring to even see the Pitt Rivers Museum, which seems such a quite specific space, very hostile space for LGBTQ plus communities, to actually engage with this and saying, how do we utilize it? How do we actually use this space as a space that can question? This was the Intrepid Women exhibition that I talked about a little bit. Other projects that we're doing are with so forced migrants and refugees, which is really about sort of looking at how can we change our practices of care and access and engagement and include communities that would really benefit from having that sort of access. And for a lot of the communities, it's sort of on the one hand enhanced and changed how we interpret the collections, but it also has helped them to get trained, find work, find schooling, and improve their English. So that's sort of what has come out of that project very much. And there's an exhibition opening today, yes. There's another project which really I've called one of the most exciting projects that has happened with ethnographic collections recently. This is a project with the Nuffield Department of Primary Health Care, with community members living with medical conditions and needing assisted living technology. So panic buttons, for example, or walking sticks, and we've sort of done a couple of pairings with objects that are similar or medicine boxes. So this is the pharmaceutical industry, and the NHS spend quite a bit of money on designing and making these, plastic or panic buttons, but people don't really understand how to use them. So often the panic buttons, they just end up in, just underneath the bed or something. And people don't, or people overuse them. They think that they're always protected by them. And they'll travel to Spain and think that they're still protected by the panic button, while it only works in the confines of your own home. So what we wanted to sort of look at is, how does that work? And so we brought these technology designers and people living with the assisted living technologies and the researchers and makers into one space, and did a whole series of workshops, and really to look at objects that have a similar function but are designed very differently across the globe. And for example, with amulets, people know exactly how they protect you. They know exactly when they protect you and what you need to do to actually make sure that they protect you. And so it's sort of looking at what are the cultural values that are actually embedded in those objects, and how could you then reinterpret the way that these objects need to be made for individuals by pharmaceutical industries or by the NHS in the UK. And this lady who was 80 and who was a really sort of keen participant, very sort of positively wrote about, for her, what was the value of this project and how it was really sort of a stimulation that was lacking for us oldies, as she said. I suppose normally we associate with others around our own age and in like-minded groups, but with your sessions, the mixture of ages 18 to 80 on Monday, with such a diverse range of experiences and knowledge, really gelling together was inspiring. It made me feel young again. Thank you again, and I do hope there will be more for us. So we are applying for another big grant to continue this work. We work with children who are school refusers, and this is really where we're sort of, for 5 years now, 40 kids have worked in, so who don't want to go to school, who have a hate learning. We're trying to sort of see if giving them the opportunity to engage with the arts actually will change their attitude towards learning. And for some of them, apparently it's been completely transformational. That's what their parents tell us. So it's quite nice. It's a big problem in the UK, and also it's quite well known that school refusers often also is related to knife crime, and knife crime is really on the rise in the UK. So it's quite a really nice project, I think. It's small, so a lot of what we do is quite small, but does have a big impact. Do we want to try? This is a 3-minute film, which sort of, it just closes off and gives an overview of these things again. Shall we try to put it on? I don't know if it's going to work. But, So it's spoken in Scottish by my head of administration, and it's a bit sort of promotional, but also addresses the sort of work that we do very much.
These photos of young Tibetans hanging in our main hall ask how you can be at once old and new, traditional and contemporary. We at Pitt Rivers know how that feels. There have been attempts to relocate the Pitt Rivers Museum to a place like this, but we believe that would be far too easy. Instead, we like a challenge to reinvigorate the space we inherited 130 years ago, to constantly rethink how we interpret the 55,000 objects on display and how we understand the 500,000 items of all kinds under our care. This year, in particular, that reinvention has become a quiet revolution. What do you do when you've got no more space? You invite the world in. We're working with forced migrants to change the way we tell stories, offering opportunities to develop workplace skills, well-being and confidence in their new home. We work with the Maasai here in the museum and in contact with their elders via social media to improve the way we talk about the collections and understand how some we hold are problematic. By pairing unusual objects associated with health and the person, we are finding creative ways to improve and humanise the everyday objects in our health system. We believe in caring for each other as much as caring for things. To do that, we're facing up to our history. We're bringing in voices that many institutions, including ourselves, have silenced in the past. Take our labels. When they were written, they used language that was derogatory, shocking, and led us to be called one of the most violent places in Oxford. When we were challenged, we'd literally paint them out. Now, instead, we're rethinking the way we tell the stories and who is invited to tell them. We know that when we listen, we learn, and we like to share the knowledge we've gained through 37,000 visitors' education sessions and to 16,000 people who came to participate in our events this year. We've built innovative digital tools so you can explore our objects in augmented reality and online at home. And behind those riotous creative scenes, we've moved, numbered and repacked 80,000 items, the same weight as 30 elephants. Everything from this box of candle snuffers to some poison arrows to more than 800 pencils we have found dropped under the museum's heating rates. For 50,000 visitors, we're the same place, but we're not staying still. They say you should expect to be amazed and surprised, provoked and overwhelmed even. Some have compared us to a double espresso. You could call us a true wild card amongst British institutions if you're Michael Palin, or think of a new name altogether. We know a great space where you can think.
So if you would come and visit the Pitt Rivers Museum today, you would find a sort of multi-layered elements that are in the space. So because we've done quite a bit of sort of intervention also in the main space. So there's the LGBT flag, which works, sort of points towards the beyond the binary. There's here in the front, you can't see it very well because it's quite light, but you can see in the front here, you'll see Hans, who's a Haida weaver, who's giving a weaving workshop on our Clore Learning balcony. There's up there's the Syrians Unknown portraits, which is really work that was done by a photographer in Damascus, working with people who had to flee, and so really talking about not so much people as refugees, because people tend to get reduced to the status of refugee, but actually about their personal aspirations and hope, and also their skill sets. And then very prominently hung in the museum is a display of work by this fantastic Tibetan photographer. She's a fashion photographer, but also makes fabulous portraits. And she was inspired by our collections by going through the 1920s sort of type photography of Tibet. And thinking through the negative and the positive sides of those type photography, she sort of felt like, this is interesting. It almost talks to me about how I am at once traditional and contemporary at once. And so on the other side of those photos, you'll see the same person, not in their daily wear that they were wearing when they were brought in, and not identifying themselves through a certain object that they brought, but actually in their traditional clothing with one of the objects that they related to home. And it really sort of talks about the cultural vibrancy of today, cultural young people, and we do quite a bit of programs with kids and adolescents and adults of Tibet who live in London that are related to this. So the other thing that people will find is, and this is sort of returning the gaze to our Cook case, is a portrait, or a photo actually. It's a set of 3 photos made by Christian Thompson, who's a Bijara photographer, so Aboriginal photographer who did his PhD in Oxford, and working through the collections was sort of quite impressed by those collections on the one hand because he felt there was a sort of he got a sense of spiritual repatriation, as he called it, by going through the collections. But also he, in this work, which is called Othering the Explorer James Cook, he took the portrait of Cook and cut out his eyes and sort of returning the gaze and asking him, who were you to come and collect us and other us in this way? And in the gallery, it's actually sort of it's placed at the back of our learning balcony, so very much at the core of everything that we do. And this portrait is staring back and sort of returning the gaze to the Cook case, where we have 230 objects that were collected on the voyages, the first and second voyage, by Banks and the Forsters on the Cook voyages. So, and then you would find opening at the end of this month 2 other exhibitions. So one is the Multaka Connecting Threads, and the other one is the Land of the Calais Jungle and Beyond, which is really, again, a sort of co-curated exhibition which reassembles material and visual culture that was collected in the Calais jungle in France before it was wiped out and sort of made into a garbage pile. Again, I think you call it differently in English. But and so this is really a wide range of objects that is, again, in the museum. And apart from that, the Syrians Unknown, which are these portraits in the museum. I think the thing that has inspired us quite a bit is some of the recent writing around the decolonial turn and the reckoning with this colonialism. And mostly, I think, the sort of idea that if we want to engage seriously with these questions, and how we treat one another. This is from Zoe Todd, who wrote a really quite a nice piece last year in June. And how we treat one another and what worlds we want to build together. No longer will we allow for abuse, exploitation, racism and sexism to parade as markers of rigorous anthropology. So it's really thinking around a different sort of anthropology. I think that's what we're trying to do. And obviously there's a lot to be done still, but that's where we're heading. Thank you.